Chapter 11. Jake's Song. 24 hours is a long trip in any vehicle, but while the Bryant's family van was old, it was quite roomy and comfortable. Zach could remember previous trips to Manitoulin Island with his whole family on board. After spending the first couple of hours chilling out with his seat reclined, his earphones in, choosing tunes off the iPod, Zach decided to join in the lively conversation. Uncle James and Aunt Sandra weren't like his parents, on his case for everything, or so he felt. With his aunt and uncle, Zach felt a friendly camaraderie. He liked them a lot. "I guess this is going to be a rather quiet week for you, Zach," Aunt Sandra was saying with a compassionate smile. "How long has it been since you had that concussion?" Zach calculated the time. Almost 6 weeks ago he had been in the final performance. He could well remember the adrenaline rush on stage with Melissa. Nearly a week later he'd gone to the school dance and been beaten up by Shane's gang of thugs.
"It's been about 5 weeks since I got the concussion,"
he mumbled, choosing not to tell her about the blow he'd sustained at the basketball party. So far, he and Jake had managed to keep the second small concussion a secret.
"The doctor says I have to avoid sports all summer."
"So what will you do in the afternoons at camp?" Aunt Sandra asked, trying to make conversation. The question led to a brainstorming session on afternoon options for Zach. Uncle James suggested canoeing and offered to be his partner if he needed one. Esther suggested he could come with her to choir, which didn't appeal to Zach, even though he loved to sing.
"It won't be anything like the musical,"
he told himself. Aunt Sandra suggested he try frisbee golf or lifeguarding. She also told him about the Agora sessions where people gathered to ask the speakers questions regarding their talks. Zach thought canoeing sounded the best.
"I'll get an upper body workout at least."
After a while, Uncle James asked,
"Hey, Zach, do you have any music on that iPod that you'd like to share?"
On the long, straight freeway, Uncle James was feeling a little sleepy.
"Sure,"
Zach said, handing the small device to Aunt Sandra. Once it was plugged into the dock, everyone was able to enjoy the vast variety of music that had been collected. "Hey, that's Jake's favorite song," Esther called out as an upbeat song began to play.
"Really?"
Uncle James said, turning the song up a little louder. He listened to it carefully. Zach liked the song as well. It had a good beat and a nice melody. The message was about God's love, His grace, His willingness to always take His children back, no matter what they had done. It was a song about mercy and forgiveness. "What do you think of it, Uncle James?" Esther asked when it was over. Turning the music down low, Uncle James considered his answer carefully.
"Without God's grace and mercy, none of us would have any hope of salvation,"
he began.
"I do agree with the sentiments, but we have to be careful we don't take God's grace for granted. There is a big if involved." "What do you mean?" Zach asked. "God's grace is there not only to forgive us, but also to bring us to repentance and to change our lives. God is looking for spiritual growth in us, not stagnation. We are free to serve Christ, not to serve ourselves." Zach nodded slowly. He wasn't entirely sure what his uncle was driving at. Aunt Sandra looked back at Zach and smiled. "Uncle James has had a lot of discussion on this topic with one of his Christian friends," she explained. "I have," Uncle James agreed. "My friend Steve and I don't exactly see eye to eye on this. Steve sees the God of the Old Testament as very different from the God of the New. To him, the law of Moses was an experiment that failed, rather than a tutor to bring us to Christ." Passing a large transport truck, Uncle James was preoccupied for a moment. But when they were safely in the right lane again, he continued, "I was just saying to Steve the other day, God could have sent his son to the world immediately after Adam and Eve sinned. God promised them a savior right then. But he waited another 4,000 years. During those 4,000 years, God instituted the law of Moses, which established his standards of behavior, and also convicted every human being as a sinner. Regardless of how faithfully anyone tried to keep the law, failure in one aspect made you guilty of all. No one could keep it perfectly, or honestly feel that they deserved salvation. So it was impossible to keep? It was impossible to keep perfectly, and therefore could not bring salvation in and of itself, which is why my friend would say the law was a failure. Wasn't it?" Looking at his nephew in the rearview mirror, Uncle James asked, "What is one good reason the law couldn't be a mistake?" "Well, I suppose because God doesn't make mistakes," Zach reasoned. "Good answer." Uncle James smiled. "God doesn't make mistakes, as he knows the end from the beginning. So of course the law had a valuable purpose. It elevated the behavior of everyone who followed the decrees. It taught us the holiness of God, which he asks us to imitate. I also believe that none of us can ever appreciate grace unless we are fully convicted in our hearts that we deserve the opposite. Once God establishes a healthy, respectful appreciation for his holy standards and a conviction that we are all sinners deserving death, he then brought his Son into the world and revealed more fully the new covenant of grace.
But wasn't David saved by grace after his sin with Bathsheba? Aunt Sandra questioned. I thought there wasn't any sacrifice that could be given for sins of that nature.
You're right,
Uncle James agreed, switching lanes to allow for merging traffic.
Grace is given throughout the Old Testament because God is the same God today as he was then. David confessed his sin and recognized he deserved death, and God told him he was forgiven. God is and always will be a God of love and grace, but his mercy is extended to those who are convinced of his majesty and of their own inadequacy. He looks to those who are poor and of a contrite spirit and tremble at his word. So, do you like the song or not?
Zach asked. Uncle James chuckled.
I like it. It's good to be reminded that forgiveness is extended on the basis of mercy and grace, not our own good deeds. I'm just saying, don't lose sight of the respect we should have for God and his righteousness. No effective parent-child relationship can function with unconditional mercy like the song portrays. There is a big if involved. God laid a foundation of fear and holiness before sending his Son for a very good reason. I read an article just the other day which said, any so-called faith in Christ, which professes to release men from obedience to God, is not faith, but presumption.
What is the big if? Esther asked.
The big if is a repentant attitude and a true desire to change our ways to God's.
Uncle James explained.
Okay,
Zach reasoned, still trying to determine how his uncle felt about the music.
I think you're saying that you like the song, but you feel it lacks balance. Exactly.
Uncle James nodded. Esther was thinking over everything that her uncle had said. If good deeds aren't important to God, then why do we try to do good? Uncle James looked up at her in the rearview mirror and smiled.
Good deeds are very important, Esther,
he told her.
Jesus did good works. God commands us to do good works. If we truly have faith in God and sincerely love him, good works will flow from us. But faithful believers do good not to earn anything from God or to receive praise from men. They do what is right when their hearts are right with God, when God's Spirit, as found in his word, dwells in them.
Aunt Sandra agreed with her husband and added, the offer of eternal life and the sacrifice that Jesus made for us is too great to be repaid by any good deeds that we can do. Salvation is a priceless gift. I like to think that good deeds are our way of saying thank you to God, if that's not too trite a way of explaining it. No, that helps, Esther assured her.
You know,
Uncle James added,
I have always liked the analogy William Tyndale used at one of his last defenses. He was challenged about whether we are saved by faith alone, or whether we need works. His answer, by the way, cost him his life. He said, the fruit on a tree does not make the tree good or bad. It simply demonstrates what kind of tree it is. That quote has always stuck with me. If our lives lack good works, or are filled with bad works, we have to question the value of our belief.
Esther and Zach were quiet for a few moments. While Esther was contemplating how good deeds fit into the balance of life, Zach was considering the concept of unconditional mercy. He wondered whether or not he fully appreciated the big if, and the right balance between God's mercy and judgment. Noticing that it was 6 o'clock, Uncle James turned on the world news. There were a number of big stories. 5 super tornadoes had ripped across the United States, causing millions of dollars of damage and over 100 deaths. Massive dust storms had created extraordinary chaos in Arizona. Fires were raging in California, and an earthquake had hit Ottawa, causing structural damage to the Parliament buildings. To top it all, Turkey and Iraq had joined the growing alliance with Russia. Britain and America were alarmed by the aggressive, bold moves. Even Canada was voicing concern. Russian warships continued to stream into the Mediterranean, troops were massing at the borders, and weapons were being stockpiled in Syria and Iran. Everyone was asking why there was a need for such a strong military presence. We all know what Russia intends to do, Esther said soberly. Now you'll have some more things to add to your talk, Uncle James. He's doing that talk again this week, Aunt Sandra told her quietly, still astonished by the news they had just heard.
It's all happening so fast, I can hardly keep that talk up to date,
Uncle James exclaimed.
But there's still a lot that has to happen,
Zach told himself.
It could easily be another 10 years before the Russian Confederacy moves down into Egypt and up into Israel.
Chapter 12. At Camp. The rest of the trip went smoothly as they did the daily Bible readings together, played a few traveling games, and had a fantastic meal at a little French restaurant. They stayed overnight in a small hotel, rose early the next morning, and spent another long day in the van. It was close to 8 o'clock the next night when they turned onto Cooper Drive. Golden sunlight streamed through the darkening forest as they rumbled down the dirt road that led to the Manitoulin Bible Camp. A calm feeling settled over Zach as he and Esther gazed out the windows, watching rays of sunshine flicker through the trees. Aunt Sandra tried to spot a deer. Zach felt like he was returning home, coming back to another world with different friends and different priorities.
What kind of week will I have?
He wondered.
Will I be envying Jake the whole time, or be glad to be here?
How far is it from the highway to the camp? Esther asked.
About 2.5 kilometers,
Uncle James replied.
Perfect,
Zach exclaimed.
If I run to the highway and back every morning, I'll keep up some training. I don't want Jake to outdo me in everything when we get home. Maybe I'll join you,
Uncle James said, much to Zach's delight.
Really?
Your Uncle James is training for the Kids with Cancer Marathon again, Aunt Sandra said proudly. He's running 3 times a week. Uncle James' charity marathon had raised thousands of dollars to help kids with cancer. Zach and his family had cheered him on several times.
Good for you, Uncle James,
Zach exclaimed.
I'd love to run together.
Pulling in past the open gate, Zach looked up to see Noah and Brennan heading toward them. His old friends recognized the Bryant's van right away. Waving and shouting, they followed the van all the way to the campsite where Uncle James always pitched his tent. Parking under a large maple, Uncle James reached over and squeezed his wife's hand.
We're here, Buttes. Let the good times begin.
Esther and Zach rushed out of the van to greet their friends. Uncle James and Aunt Sandra were eager to see everyone as well. They all hugged and remarked on the changes they noticed from the year before. Esther was taller than Brennan, and Noah had caught up to Zach.
Hey, I like your hair,
Noah exclaimed. Zach smirked and rubbed his hair uneasily. He still wasn't sure he liked his new hairstyle, or lack of one. It wasn't stubble anymore, but it was shorter than he'd had it for years. He looked at Noah. A redhead with an athletic, wiry build, Noah had always been on the small side, but not anymore.
How did you get as tall as me?
Jack chided affectionately, pushing his friend away.
I'll be taller than you yet.
Noah grinned, pushing back.
Never,
Zach exclaimed with a laugh. They locked arms and attempted to push each other backwards. It wasn't as easy as it used to be for Zach to win, and they ended up on the ground in a laughing heap. Then Hannah showed up with a group of 4 other girls.
Jake's shadow,
Zach thought, remembering the crush she'd had on his brother ever since Jake had taught her and her friends how to play ping pong. As he picked himself up from the ground and brushed off the dead leaves, he did a double take. Hannah was up to his shoulder and quite grown up.
She's pretty,
he thought.
She's changed a lot. Where's Jake?
Brennan queried anxiously.
He didn't come this year.
Even as he said the words, Zach felt a strange sadness envelop him. The crestfallen looks on his friends' faces made him feel worse. Is he working? Hannah asked, twisting her long blonde hair into a ponytail. Her lovely blue eyes were filled with disappointment.
No, he's at a basketball camp. Oh, that's sad,
Brennan replied. Jake felt like lashing out that it wasn't sad at all, that Jake was having the opportunity of a lifetime, that if he hadn't had 2 concussions, he'd be right there with him. But as he opened his mouth to speak, suddenly he wasn't so sure. Maybe it was sad.
I wish I had called him,
Brennan mumbled, more to himself than anyone else.
I just assumed he'd be coming. Hey, do you guys want to help us set up?
Uncle James asked hopefully, pulling 2 big tarps out of the van. Noah and Brennan were eager to pitch in, and Zach was thankful for a change in the conversation. Hannah and her friends left to look after her young nieces at the park. With Uncle James' assistance, the guys strung up the tarps and set up the tents, all the while catching up on the year that had passed. Noah and Brennan had finished grade 12 and were trying to choose between the universities that had accepted them.
I was accepted at Dalhousie,
Noah told Zach.
But at the moment it's my second choice.
He laughed.
Nova Scotia is a long way away. But you could live with us,
Zach exclaimed excitedly. Having Noah back in Nova Scotia would be such a boost to all of them.
That would be fun,
Noah reflected. When all the setting up was done, Zach went with his friends to see the lake. The sun was slipping down toward the horizon as they settled on the large rock by the shore. Delicate pinks and faded orange streaked softly across the sky. The clouds had a golden edging. Without much of a breeze, the water lapped quietly against the rocky shore and mirrored the sunset perfectly.
I'm glad you're here, Zach,
Noah said with warmth in his eyes.
I wish Jake had come too. You guys make camp so much more fun.
Zach smiled. It was nice to know he was still part of the group.
I don't know how much fun I'll be.
He sighed.
I had 2 concussions last month, so I have to avoid sports for the whole summer. You're kidding!
Noah and Brennan echoed in surprise.
No sports? Zach, that's tragic.
Noah exclaimed.
I know.
Zach grimaced. He looked down at the beach to the racks of overturned canoes.
I might take up canoeing instead. We were hoping you'd join us for the 3-on-3 volleyball again. We've signed you up.
For a moment, Zach thought about giving it a try, but quickly changed his mind. He had to be in top form for basketball. He couldn't risk another hit.
Sorry, guys.
There were heavy sighs from both his friends. Looking up, Zach saw Hannah and a bunch of her girlfriends walking down the beach. Hey, they called out. Icebreakers are on at the teen classroom.
Icebreakers?
Brennan exclaimed.
We'll be there.
That night, as Zach wandered back to his campsite alone, he thought about the basketball camp. Sure, he was glad he had come to Manitoulin in many ways, but he wondered enviously what his brother was doing. Jake would have already had a full day of training, whereas Zach had been sitting lifelessly in a van, traveling for hours on end. Jake would be trying to decide if he wanted to try windsurfing or dragon boat racing, while Zach was stuck with canoes. Jake would be...
Ouch!
Zach suddenly stubbed his foot on a rock. He had forgotten to grab a flashlight before the sun went down and it was dark on the playing field.
Ooh, that hurt,
he said angrily. Then he heard giggling. It sounded quite close by.
Who's there?
He asked, peering into the darkness. He couldn't see anyone. Just us. There were more giggles.
Who's us?
Zach didn't recognize the voice. Don't step on me, his sister's voice called out with alarm. We're watching the stars.
Isn't it past curfew?
Yes, but Uncle James and Aunt Sandra are coming to watch too, Esther explained, sitting up. Zach could see his sister now, a dark shape against the trees and quite close by. Hannah's sleeping over tonight, and Uncle James said he'd show us the constellations. 2 bright flashlights were coming their way.
Sounds cool,
Zach said.
Mind if I join you?
Aunt Sandra brought a large blanket that she spread out for everyone. Lying on his back beside Uncle James, Zach was amazed at the depths of stars he could see. The sky was exceptionally clear.
It's so nice to get away from light pollution,
Uncle James sighed. Having a good knowledge of the stars and a cool laser beam pointer, Uncle James showed them various celestial wonders. He was in no hurry to rush everyone off to bed. Patiently, he explained where the constellation of Orion was and pointed out the bright lights of the planets Mars and Venus. As they lay there looking up at the marvelous display, Uncle James asked,
Why do you think God created so many stars? Just think, each one is a vast ball of burning gas, just like the sun. Why make so many?
Or why did God create so many species of trees? Aunt Sandra added. Just one variety might have been sufficient. It is amazing, Hannah agreed. Why are there hundreds of different kinds of butterflies and thousands of flowers?
So, why the overabundance, Zach?
Uncle James asked his nephew specifically. Zach thought deeply.
Well, I suppose it demonstrates that God's creativity and power is profoundly vast.
Suddenly, Hannah called out, Look! A shooting star! Zach caught the tail end. It had streaked right across the sky.
Amazing!
He shouted. For the next 15 minutes, they all watched intently for shooting stars. Aunt Sandra was the first to notice a second bright streak. For the next 15 minutes, they all watched intently for shooting stars. Aunt Sandra was the first to notice a second bright streak. There were several minutes of silence as they absorbed the awesome display of power above them. Speaking quietly, Aunt Sandra quoted a psalm. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you visit him." The verse resonated in Zach's mind long after he crawled into his sleeping bag.
God's creation is so magnificent,
he considered.
I'm just a tiny speck down here on earth in his eyes. I have all these huge plans for my life, but so do millions of other people. What are my plans compared to God's?
The answer was simple.
Insignificant.
Chapter 13. Canoeing. Zach headed glumly to the small, sandy beach on Sunday afternoon. Uncle James had been asked to help run the baseball program, so he was unable to go canoeing with his nephew. Still, they had run 5 kilometers together that morning, and Zach was pleasantly surprised how well his uncle kept up. Sure, Zach had sprinted the last kilometer by himself, but Uncle James had a good, steady pace. He was in decent shape. Standing on the beach, Zach wondered if he would be able to steer a canoe alone.
I could always go watch everyone play baseball,
he thought to himself.
Jaden's crippled brother told me I could cheer on the team. Isaiah is amazing,
he considered.
He always makes the best of his situation and gives what he can to others.
But Zach didn't have a heart to cheer or throw balls back from the sidelines. The temptation to get involved seemed too compelling, so he had decided to stay away. The beach was crowded with young parents and children. Kids were digging in the sand and wading into the warm, shallow water. It was a hot, sunny afternoon, and gentle waves rippled across the small lake. A few young girls stood waiting for a turn in the paddle boats, but there weren't any teenagers around. The teens were all playing sports. Zach looked up at the canoes on the racks.
If I paddle alone, will I go around in circles?
He sighed.
Guess I'll figure it out somehow.
As the lifeguard helped him bring a shiny red canoe down to the water, Zach was surprised to hear someone call his name. Looking up, he saw Noah striding toward him with a tackle box and 2 fishing poles in his hand.
"Hey, Zach!"
Noah called out.
"Can I join you?" "For sure,"
Zach replied enthusiastically.
"You're not playing sports?" "It's kind of hot out today."
Noah shrugged.
"Canoeing sounds more exciting."
Zach didn't reply, but he smiled appreciatively. He knew it wasn't too hot. Noah would play sports any day, regardless of the weather. He was very thankful his friend was choosing to join him. Pushing out into the water and paddling hard together, they glided quickly across the lake. Noah guided them to a spot where he claimed his dad had caught a fish 2 days before. There were not many fish in the small, shallow lake, but every now and then someone would come back with a good catch. They took turns casting and rowing. While there was absolutely no action on their lines, they kept trying.
"Have you thought about coming back here for youth conference in August?"
Noah asked, pulling the line in slowly.
"No, not really." "You could stay with us for the next 5 weeks and fly back when conference is over."
Zach considered the option briefly.
"I've committed to helping out with Uncle Peter's business,"
he said. After another moment's reflection, he added,
"And don't you have to do a whole lot of Bible study for conference? Like an entire 100-page workbook?" "Not more than you could get done in the next month, and it's been a fascinating study. I've learned so much about the life of Job." "Have you finished it already?" "I have 1 chapter left. I've been working on it since February." "When do you ever find time to do Bible study?"
Zach moaned.
"Between school, homework, and sports, I'm flat out until it's time for bed. I mean, we read the Bible every night as a family, but to do extra Bible study on top of that? How do you do it?" "I always spend an hour on it right after I get home from school." That's when Jake and I work out." "Don't you get enough exercise playing sports at school?"
Zach thought back on intramurals and after-school practices. Often, he even had phys ed. He did get a lot of exercise, but...
"Jake and I are in training,"
he explained rather proudly.
"Our coach thinks we have a good chance of making it to the provincials next year. We only missed out by 1 game last season, so he's given us a strict exercise program. It's helped a lot." "You need some time for spiritual training too."
Noah smiled.
"Just doing an hour a day has given me a whole new perspective." "A new perspective on what?"
Zach questioned. Reeling in his taunt line for the third time, only to discover another entangled weed, Noah was disappointed.
It's hard to explain,
he replied slowly, pulling the weed off his hook.
It's kind of like playing an intense game of basketball where you suddenly come alive and feel a surge of energy. When I get into Bible study, it becomes exciting, and I discover things that amaze me. So often I've had some problem or issue I'm struggling to figure out, and I'll find the answer in the study I'm doing.
Looking up skeptically, Zach reeled in his own line to pull off the weeds. He couldn't imagine Bible study could compare in any way to a basketball game.
Have you ever caught anything in this lake?
he asked his friend.
No, but my dad caught a 16-inch bass the first day we got here.
Noah boasted.
I know they're out here somewhere.
But when another 15 minutes went past and there hadn't been so much as a nibble, the boys changed plans and decided to see how fast they could skim across the water in the canoe. Action was what Zach loved. Fast, intense, heart-racing action. It was even better when it ended up with a refreshing spill into the lake. Noah had purposely leaned over too far. Chapter 14. The Last Days. Classes began Monday morning. The study on Moses, whom Zach had always thought he knew so much about, challenged him to carefully consider the similarities between Moses' life in Egypt and his own in Stirling, Nova Scotia. In Egypt, Moses had grown up with an abundance of everything, riches, pleasure, and fame. Zach was quietly impressed that Moses had chosen to give it all up, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward.
Moses didn't choose to be with God's people because it was more fun,
Zach reflected.
He gave up the fun to suffer with God's people. Would I have made the same choice?
He asked himself.
Or would I have chosen to remain a prince in the palace?
It didn't take long to answer that question. He knew he would have chosen to stay in the palace.
And what about my life?
He asked himself.
Am I taking everything this world has to offer and enjoying the passing pleasures of sin? Have I ever given anything up for God? Anything that is difficult to part with?
While the talks on Moses captured Zach's imagination, the second series, In the Last Days, Perilous Times Will Come, impacted him to truly re-examine every aspect of his life. It had been a whole year since Zach had last escaped from all the distractions of the world and allowed God's word to take hold of his heart. Uncle George, as everyone affectionately called him, began his talks Monday morning telling the teens that he was going to take them through a study of the last days, the time period right before Christ's return.
We all know this is where we are in history,
Uncle George stated.
We are in the last days. Jesus questioned whether or not he would find persistent faith on the earth when he returned. So as we investigate the warnings the Bible gives us about our time period in history, we need to be constantly asking ourselves, how does this apply to us? And especially, how does it apply on a very personal level?
Growing up in a household that read the Bible every day, Zach was familiar with the passage Uncle George took them to in 2 Timothy chapter 3. However, he had never considered it personally.
Now, as we read through these verses,
Uncle George said,
I want everyone to think carefully about whether or not our society fits this description, or whether you think more time is needed for it to become this corrupt.
Looking in Zach's direction, Uncle George asked him to read out the verses to the class. A little skeptical that society could already be as bad as it would get before Christ's return, Zach read the passages slowly. As he read, he thought about each characteristic in light of his youth group and his classmates at Stirling High.
But know this,
he read,
that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. And from such people Turn away.
He looked up at Uncle George in astonishment when he was done.
Everything fits,
he thought.
Thanks, Zach,
Uncle George said, and then he began to go through each characteristic in more detail. Uncle George even had newspaper quotes to prove these characteristics were the prevailing attitude. The scariest part was that Zach began to see himself in the verses. Had he become just like the civilization which was soon to be destroyed? How often had his parents told him that he thought the world revolved around him?
I've been very self-centered recently,
he considered.
Disobeying my parents, lying to them, unthankful for what I have, and unloving. In the last few months, I've acted in a headstrong, haughty manner, determined to live life as I please, regardless of what anyone else thinks. And with the school play, I certainly loved pleasure more than God. The musical came before everything. Am I like the people described here as having a form of godliness, calling myself a Christian, but denying God's power to transform my life?
Always before, when Zach had compared himself to the other renegades in his youth group, he felt confident that he was leading a fairly good life, even if he hadn't yet chosen to be baptized. After all, he wasn't doing drugs, or obsessed with violent video games. He'd never even had a girlfriend. But now, faced with a list of wrong attitudes in 2 Timothy 3, he felt guilty. He left class that day with his head down, carefully thinking things over.
What if these really are the last days? The last minutes before Christ returns?
He pondered.
I know I'm on the wrong side. I need to change.
Chapter 15. The Boys Cook Dinner.
I feel so out of shape,
Zach moaned Wednesday morning at breakfast.
I haven't done anything the past few days.
He and Uncle James had made great plans for jogging the camp road every morning, but with evening devotionals, teen choir practice, and card games until midnight, it was difficult to rise early the next day. So far, they'd only jogged once.
In that case, maybe I could challenge you to an arm wrestle.
Uncle James grinned.
A whole week without training, and you might be on par with me. Bring it on.
Zach was eager for the challenge, and Uncle James put up a good fight. There were a few tense moments when the challenge looked like it could go either way, but 3 times in a row, Zach flattened his uncle's arm in less than a minute. Folding his defeated arms together, Uncle James sat back and studied his nephew with amusement.
What do you think, Sandra?
He asked, his brown eyes twinkling.
Would Zach reach my incredible level of fitness if we kept him out of training for a whole month?
Esther was proud of her brother's strength. I hate to say it, Uncle James, she exclaimed, but even if Zach didn't do any training ever, you might need to go back a little in time, maybe 10 years to beat him. Her uncle chuckled.
What are you saying?
He asked, mockingly indignant.
That I've lost my physique?
He flexed his arm muscles.
There's still a good bulge here.
Aunt Sandra and Esther laughed as Zach showed off his biceps. They were considerably bigger. 10 years ago, Zach wouldn't have had a chance, Aunt Sandra chipped in supportively.
That's my wife.
Uncle James smiled. Then he seemed to think it over more carefully.
Just a second. 10 years ago, Zach was only 7.
Aunt Sandra tried to explain what she really meant, but it ended in laughter. Turning his attention back to his nephew, Uncle James said,
Well, Zach, you've been paddling every afternoon, getting an upper body workout, so maybe that's not your area of weakness. Perhaps we should try leg lifts.
How would you do leg lifts around here? Aunt Sandra laughed affectionately. Uncle James pondered the matter carefully.
I know,
he said with a smile.
Let's see who can do a tree squat the longest.
Tree squat? Esther queried. But Uncle James was already heading toward the large maple that sheltered his campsite. With a grin, Zach positioned himself in front of a birch, facing his uncle.
You're timing us, Buttes?
Uncle James called out. Aunt Sandra moved her arm so she could see her watch and gave the countdown. Zach and his uncle dropped down to a squat position with their backs against the tree. Time ticked by and Uncle James' legs started to shake. He held on for a bit longer, even though his face was going red, while Zach held his position with ease. Finally, Uncle James admitted defeat. 1 minute and 27 seconds, Aunt Sandra exclaimed. Zach held on for another whole minute before pronouncing victory.
Maybe you're not so out of shape after all.
Uncle James grinned, patting Zach on the back. Zach laughed.
Just remember,
his uncle added in a more serious tone,
that bodily exercise is profitable for a little, but godliness is profitable for all things.
Rubbing his nephew's short hair affectionately, Uncle James added,
Just because you can't see your brain growing bigger, don't discount what's happening there this week.
Zach nodded. Maybe things weren't as bad as he thought. Why don't you invite your friends over for dinner tonight? Aunt Sandra suggested suddenly to Zach and Esther. I have enough chicken for at least 4 extra people. Can I invite Hannah and Elizabeth? Esther asked.
I could ask Noah and Brennan.
Zach considered. Sure, Aunt Sandra said. Then she remembered something. Oh, you're giving the talk tonight, aren't you? She said to Uncle James. Maybe tonight isn't a good night for company.
Right, and we have the Agora session until 5. That leaves us a little short on time. Esther and I could cook the meal,
Zach suggested.
Just leave out some instructions for us.
Really? Aunt Sandra asked. Esther nodded fervently. Mom leaves me instructions all the time. As Aunt Sandra dubiously considered the matter, Uncle James gave the answer.
They'll have fun with it, Sandra,
he said.
Give them a chance.
Then Uncle James looked at his watch.
Hey, it's almost 8:30,
he said.
We'd better get over to the pavilion. Time for classes to start.
Once again that morning, Uncle George's class was thought-provoking and challenging. The day before, he had considered the scoffers that would come in the last days, looking particularly at the negative effects the theory of evolution and the philosophy of humanism were having on society's worldview.
Today's class,
Uncle George announced at the very beginning,
is about the decline of morality in the world and the effect that licentious living is having on believers. Here's an interesting paradox,
Uncle George continued.
Today we have gays and lesbians clamoring for the right to be married, while many heterosexual couples are disregarding marriage and initiating sexual relationships long before making a covenant to one another. Ungodly behavior is becoming commonplace, even among those who profess to be Christian. But we must never lose sight of God's standard of morality. Remember, young people, it's not for the world to define morality for us. As believers, we must hold on to the standard that God has set.
Uncle George had the class turn to several passages on the matter. The one that struck Zach the most was 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9. Hannah read the passage from the NIV. Do you not know that the wicked will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor male prostitutes, nor homosexual offenders, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God.
Do not be deceived,
Uncle George repeated firmly.
If God is warning us not to be deceived, that means we may easily find ourselves justifying these actions and behaviors, especially when we see them so prevalent around us. But in God's eyes, sexual relationships outside of a marriage covenant are wrong, regardless of how committed we may feel we are to the relationship. If we choose to engage in sex before marriage and justify our actions, the warning is that we may be rejected at the judgment seat. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And notice, too,
Uncle George pointed out from 1 Corinthians 6,
that homosexuals and sodomites are among the unrighteous. Homosexuality is not an alternative lifestyle that God recognizes, whether a marriage has taken place or not. It is wrong for a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. The Apostle Paul urges us in 1 Corinthians, shun immorality. Every other sin which a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. God wants to be the Lord of our bodies and dwell in us as his holy temple. All sin comes from our heart, and we are all afflicted with varying weaknesses towards one sin or another. But every single one of us can make a choice whether to inflame and follow the base desires of our hearts, or pray for God's help to overcome the flesh, deny ourselves, and seek his righteousness. Now, in saying all that,
Uncle George added in softer tones,
there is forgiveness for those who have sinned but sincerely repent. If you cry to God for help and don't make provision for the flesh, God will help you to overcome. He wants you to overcome. He promises to make a way of escape for every temptation, but we have to choose to take it.
Terry, one of the older teens, interjected.
Isn't all sin equal? You just said that everyone struggles with sin in one way or another. So if I have sex before marriage, or break the speed limit, or yell at my parents, or become a homosexual, it's all just sin. We're all sinners. We can't help ourselves. All we can do is trust in God's grace and mercy. It's true that the wages of sin is death.
Uncle George smiled.
And in that sense, regardless of what we do, we all deserve death. But the consequences of some sins far outweigh others. I may break the speed limit and face a fine of $200. However, if I choose to kill someone when I'm angry, I will likely be in prison for the rest of my life. I will feel great remorse for the pain and loss I have caused others. And don't be deceived. The consequences of sexual immorality can play havoc with our future relationships and emotional well-being.
Zach couldn't help think of his father's oft-quoted axiom.
The Christian life isn't the path of least resistance, but it is the path of least regrets.
Terry was shaking his head.
There is also a big difference between willful sin and accidental sin.
Uncle George added kindly.
There is no sacrifice to cover willful sin. There wasn't one in the Old Testament, and there isn't one under Christ. Hebrews chapter 10 says, "For if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment."
What is willful sin? Hannah asked.
The word means willingly, to act with intent and purpose, premeditated.
Uncle George told her.
It's a decision to sin rather than an accidental lapse of weakness. But we're under grace,
Terry argued.
The law of Moses failed because humans are too weak to keep God's law. We just need to believe in God's grace to save us despite our failings. We can't be righteous. God makes us righteous if we have faith in Him.
Uncle George opened up the discussion for a class debate. For 10 minutes, many opinions were aired and a few passages were suggested. Hannah found a verse that supported what Uncle George had been saying. She read out 1 John 2, which says, "Now by this we know that we know Him, if we keep His commandments. He who says, 'I know Him,' and does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps His word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in Him. He who says he abides in Him ought himself also to walk just as He walked." In many ways, Wednesday's class was the most intense appeal Uncle George had given all week. In the canoe that afternoon, Zach and Noah spent a great deal of time discussing the issues he had raised. Lulled into thinking that because everyone was doing it must be okay, Zach felt the pathway he had once contemplated taking was suddenly barred with a large "Road is closed" sign. For the first time ever, Zach was thankful that Melissa was going out with Shane.
Whoa, if I'm going to live by God's standards, I need to be very careful who I go out with. Melissa would drag me down so quickly.
Zach came back to his tent early that afternoon, drenched head to toe from another canoe race that ended upside down in the lake. As soon as Noah had changed into dry clothes, he came over. Unfortunately, Brennan was unable to join them for dinner as his family had already made other plans. Noah and Zach were eager to get dinner ready. Esther hadn't returned from the sports field yet, but Aunt Sandra's instructions had been left on the picnic table, stuck under the edge of a large cooking pot.
"Okay,"
Zach said, scanning the list.
"It looks like we're cooking chicken strips, rice, and making a salad. What would you like to do, Noah?" "I've never made a salad,"
Noah replied.
"but I can probably fry the chicken." "I'll leave the salad to Esther,"
Zach said.
"I haven't made one of those either."
He picked up the box of rice and examined the instructions on the box.
"This sounds foolproof. I'll do the rice."
Setting the box down, he consulted Aunt Sandra's list once more.
"Oh, yes!"
he exclaimed.
"She wants us to make chocolate pudding. Yum! I love chocolate pudding."
Chocolate pudding wasn't on Brett's healthy eating list. Zach figured that since he was taking the week off from exercise, he was also exempt from the diet. As Noah got the propane stove going and set the grill plate on top of the burners, Zach read the pudding box.
"We're supposed to add 2 cups of milk to each of these packages,"
he told Noah.
"The only trouble is I used the last bit of milk on my cereal this morning. Maybe Aunt Sandra picked up some from the camp store."
Checking the cooler, Zach quickly determined they were still out of milk. He took the chicken strips out of the cooler for Noah.
"No milk,"
he said.
"So what do you figure we should do?" "Maybe we should just leave it,"
Noah suggested.
"Aunt Sandra might have some other dessert tucked away." "Do you know how long it's been since I've had chocolate pudding?"
Zach asked. Noah shook his head with a smile and began laying the chicken strips on the pan.
Too long,
Zach stated, realizing he couldn't even remember. Then an idea occurred to him.
Maybe we could do a little substituting. Isn't that the mark of an experienced chef?
Noah rolled his eyes. Zach thought hard.
Milk is only liquid. Surely we could add another liquid and it would work out just as well. Maybe you'll come up with a new recipe.
Noah laughed.
Aunt Sandra will be impressed if it's good. What do you suggest? Juice? Water? Juice might add the wrong flavor.
Zach pondered.
But water should be fine.
So intent were the two of them in mixing up their watery chocolate concoction that the chicken was totally forgotten until a burnt smell wafted past them.
Oh no!
Noah exclaimed.
Not the chicken!
Zach laid down the egg beater to examine the extent of the catastrophe. The chicken was scorched on one side.
You get a fail.
Zach laughed, helping his friend flip the chicken to the other side. Noah turned the burner down to low.
I'd better try for golden brown on the other side.
He smiled.
Or I'll never live down my bad reputation. Girls don't forget things like that. I guess we need to get the rice cooking.
Zach suddenly remembered.
And where are the girls? We need them to make the salad.
Glancing at his watch, Noah exclaimed,
It's 5 o'clock. Your uncle and aunt will be back soon. Okay,
Zach said, trying to get everything in order.
I don't know why this pudding isn't getting thick. We're only supposed to beat it for 2 minutes and we did it for 10. But you get the rice cooking and I'll work on the salad.
Zach placed the pudding in the cooler, hoping a little refrigeration might help it to set. The boys worked feverishly for the next 10 minutes, expecting the others to show up at any time. The salad was ready and the rice cooking before Esther appeared with her friends, Hannah and Elizabeth. She was carrying a liter of milk. Sorry we're late, she apologized, but our volleyball game just finished.
Sure,
Zach complained with a smile.
Leave us to do all the cooking while you girls play.
He caught sight of the milk.
Hey, where did you get that?
From the store, she replied. Aunt Sandra told me I'd need it for the pudding. Zach and Noah exchanged sheepish glances.
Oops,
Zach said. What's wrong?
We already made the pudding.
Noah replied confidently.
There's no need for milk. Zach's created a new recipe. Right, a camping recipe.
Zach announced, folding his arms across his chest.
When you don't have milk, use water.
He puffed out his chest and stood tall.
Our recipe has less calories and is far more adaptable to a camping menu.
Hannah and Esther examined the pudding in the cooler. You can drink it like tea, Hannah giggled, letting the pudding pour off a spoon back into the bowl. I think something's burning, Elizabeth said, looking toward the stove.
Oh no, not again.
Noah moaned, turning from the pudding catastrophe back to his chicken. Sure enough, the other side was beginning to scorch. Here come Uncle James and Aunt Sandra, Esther called out, seeing them in the distance, walking down the road. Zach looked up to see his aunt and uncle strolling across the sports playing field with 3 little children in tow. There were almost always children following Aunt Sandra. She had won many little hearts teaching at camp. Come on, girls, Esther said. Let's set the table. At least Aunt Sandra will find one thing done right.
What do you mean?
Asked the indignant Zach.
Everything's done, thanks to us.
Aunt Sandra took the young children to their own campsite and then returned to check on the meal. She did her best to be positive over the burned chicken, starchy rice, and rather hastily put together salad. I certainly appreciate the effort, she remarked with a smile, scraping black crumbs off the chicken strips with her knife. Uncle James asked Noah to give thanks for the meal. Then he helped his nephew serve everything out. The rice didn't want to come off the spoon. The chicken was speckled and dry.
Just remember,
Uncle James reminded them in his most fatherly tone,
that we thanked God for this food. If you were orphans living on your own in Kenya, you might not have had anything to eat all day or the day before.
Yes, Aunt Sandra agreed. That presentation we had this morning was heart-wrenching. I'd really like to help financially with all the good work that is going on over there, James. Imagine 600 children in one Sunday school.
You'd be in paradise.
Uncle James chuckled. Elizabeth held up her lettuce for inspection. Not only was it a huge piece, but it was also quite wilted and brown around the edges. Did anyone check the lettuce before they threw it into the bowl? Trying to keep a straight face, Zach answered with mock disdain.
We're camping, girls. Our motto is, waste not, want not. I'm sure in the Sahara Desert, such lettuce would be worth maybe $10 a leaf. It's more decorative this way,
Noah added with a snicker.
The brown adds a little contrast with the green.
Since when do you throw the whole cucumber into the salad? Hannah asked, wrestling a huge piece with her fork.
Hey,
Zach remarked in defense.
We like veggies and dip. Who says it has to look like a salad? It all tastes the same anyway,
Noah added. Zach looked up to see Hannah holding the core of a tomato on the tip of her fork. And how do you explain this away? She asked with a giggle.
Compost and dip?
Zach suggested, and they all began to laugh. Uncle James and Aunt Sandra laughed with them, and the laughter continued as the girls exaggerated their efforts to cut up the huge lettuce leaves and hacksaw their way through the charred chicken. When everyone was nearly done, Zach went to check on the chocolate pudding.
Oh, no,
he groaned, looking into the cooler. Uncle James and Noah jumped up from the table to see what had happened. Aunt Sandra remained where she was with her face in her hands. Somehow the bowl had shifted and chocolate syrup had run over everything in the cooler. It was an incredible mess. Zach picked up the bowl and instantly jumped back as chocolate sauce dribbled onto the ground in front of him.
Who wants dessert?
He asked, laughing. There were no takers among the girls. Noah and Zach decided to try it, but after a few spoonfuls and lots of teasing from the girls, they declared the pudding an official disaster and poured it out in the bushes.
Do we get at least a C+?
Zach pleaded with his aunt after dinner as he helped her to clean out the cooler. Noah and the girls had kindly offered to do the dishes. Aunt Sandra laughed, washing off each chocolate-covered package of food. It depends, she said with a smile, as to whether you're referring to the entertainment value or your culinary expertise.